All right, YouTube, it's time for a second Brexit analysis. Of course, this morning, most of the news is, David Cameron's going to be resigning. He's already basically conceded that he can't stay on as prime minister beyond the immediate tense, the next month or two or thereabouts. He's a lame duck, essentially. They're going to have a new election, as well as the fact that just, the Brexit actually happened. The Leave voters, proceeded to vote. They won. The Remain camp lost. Get over it. Perhaps bigger news is the entire mainstream media of the Western world is having a meltdown. People are trying to blame, they're trying to say, oh, well, Putin must be smiling now. I disagree. I think that Russia is actually terrified of the concept of independent European states because they might actually rebuild their lagging militaries, especially the UK, some of these other states, certainly. NATO still exists. I had one person ask me, what about Poland? If they were to leave, how would they be protected from Russia? NATO and the EU are not the same thing, quite clearly. So remaining in the EU is going to fuck the military prowess of Europe up, specifically because the EU wants to create its own sort of European military. Now, you bureaucratize a military at that second level, it will fall apart. It will not be as effective as these states on their own, selling goods to one another, cross-training potentially. Of course, the U.S. does a great many exercises with its allies around the world. The idea that the European Union would be able to maintain such a system with an additional layer of bureaucracy, I think, is ludicrous. I think it's insane to think that it would actually work well. We see, look at the UN troops and how they operate in conflict zones, and you can see what the European militaries would start to resemble. It wouldn't be pretty. They wouldn't even be able to carry like loaded firearms or something like that. They'd have to shove dildos up their ass, fart measurement units so they can be taxed on their emissions. But the first big thing that's circulating right now is, of course, British economy's flatlining. If you actually look, though, the British economy has taken a hit, which was something that everybody knew was going to happen if they voted to leave. However, the other economies of the world appear to have taken a bigger hit. The European economies, especially, even the Dow here in the United States, got shocked. I think that other economies are more worried. I think the worry is the UK, unfettered from bureaucracy, will do well. And when it does well, it will start the dissolution of the rest of the EU as these other states realize, if we're sovereign, if we're independent, we can react to our own internal problems and to the world markets more efficiently without some central authority that we never elected in the first place telling us how to react to it. You look at how the Greeks got screwed, and they did. There's a reason why Golden Dawn, which is essentially a Nazi party, and Syriza, which is essentially communist light, agree in spirit on being Eurosceptic in Greece. There's a reason for this. They know they've been screwed. The Spaniards are getting more Eurosceptic. The French, certainly Le Pen in France, is now gearing up to do the same that Nigel Farage did. If they use the same basic roadmap, the French have consistently been fairly Eurosceptic. Sweden, they're now talking about a Swexit. They're now talking about an Italy exit. They're now talking about Denmark potentially holding a referendum. Now, if all the countries of the EU were to simultaneously hold a referendum tomorrow, I have no doubt that most of them would vote to remain. But the fact that the UK is left has done several important things. The first is it shows people, yes, you can leave the EU. It is possible to do so, which I think a lot of people didn't think that was really possible before. They thought, well, I don't know about this. Can we even proceed with that? Can we even exist as a state if we do this? Because a lot of the younger people probably don't remember a time they weren't in the European Union. We didn't have the sort of Eurozone stuff going on. The second thing is it will embolden Eurosceptics in these other countries. They'll get out and start campaigning with much more fervor now that they've seen that it's possible, especially in Greece, which is the only state more Eurosceptic than the UK, and probably France and Sweden that are getting up there towards UK levels. And the reason for that is France and Sweden. The UK has been hit by migration, but the primary worry appears to have been the possibility of increased migration should Turkey join the EU. It wasn't the immediate tense of migrants already here in the UK. It was more, well, we do feel mistreated. We do feel like the government has abandoned our workers and so forth to bring people in. But in Sweden and France, it's more of a flood. It's not a trickle of foreign workers that then go on the dole like it is in the UK. In Sweden, it's absolutely astronomical, the numbers we're talking about. In France and in Germany as well. Of course, the Germans, as the core of the EU, as the ones essentially in control, not the little guy Germans, but Merkel herself, are less Eurosceptic. I believe significantly less than the Swedes or the French. Certainly nobody's as Eurosceptic as the Greeks. Now, if the Greeks get out, it may drag Spain and Italy out. Some of these other more left-leaning states, they probably will leave. The Eurosceptics in the last Italian elections, they took control of the cities of Rome and Turin. That wasn't expected either. The Eurosceptic parties now hold those city positions as mayor of these cities, or whatever equivalent they have in Italy. I'm not sure exactly. I know you got provinces, you got hamlets. It doesn't make a lot of sense to somebody in the U.S., which really it's county and state, and that's really all that matters. Another thing that it will do is when the UK's economy does not collapse, and I don't think that it will, then it will show these countries, yeah, it's possible to grow your economy to do just fine outside of the EU, so why are we in the EU? Especially if the UK does very well. Now, the EU is sort of between a cock and a hard place, and I pointed this out, I think, to someone who commented on the previous video. If the EU tries to punish the UK and make life hard for them and fuck their economy down, it will be seen as tyrannical and abusive. Eurosceptic parties will use that for propaganda. They will succeed in doing so. They will gain more than a foothold in many of these countries, especially nations that don't really like the hardball stuff, the Swedes and so forth. They're going to see that as abusive. They're going to see that as mistreatment of the UK. That will embolden Eurosceptics. It'll give them a new talking point, and they'll grow more quickly. Not that they wouldn't grow anyway. I mean, the EU is doomed at this point. I've already pointed that out. If they don't crack down on the UK and they try to be conciliatory, the UK, unburdened by that regulation, once it restructures its economy, because it's now a sovereign state, is likely to begin growing much more quickly economically. It will trade more. It will probably have a larger military in the future. It will do better all around. People's quality of life will increase. And because of this, other EU states, the Eurosceptics there, will look at that and say, oh, look at what happened. The UK left. They're doing just fine. Hell, they're doing better than this state and that state. Why don't we vote to leave the European Union? So that's the other part. So there are three major things that the UK leaving has done for Eurosceptics Europe over. I don't think that the EU is long for this world. Now, some people are talking about a second referendum. That is, they've got a petition, and Parliament in the UK will debate this. What I think you'll find is that I don't think there's any will within UK politics to bother trying to do so. They have voted to leave. You're not going to get another chance. There is no do-over. It's just not going to happen. The UK's parliament will take up the issue and they'll say, oh, well, we already had the referendum. The turnout was gigantic. It's already fairly clear which way people wanted to go. Why bother holding another? Hell, if you hold another referendum, Leave voters would just be even more fervent. You'd probably have a higher proportion of Leave voters. What's the fucking point? They want to do something. 48% of the population wants a do-over because they feel that they were screwed. And they were talking about this last night, that regardless, either way, about 50% of the population would not be happy with the outcome. Somebody who doesn't care, they still don't care, but those that actually voted Leave or Remain, whichever side lost, would feel bad about it. But the proper thing to do is just get over it. It was a democratic vote. Now, look at the sort of people, and even in the American media, they're whining. They're saying, oh, the fascists are coming. Oh, Nigel Farage is like worse than Donald Trump. Oh, everything, Nazis, xenophobia, it's terrible. What are you talking about? It was a democratic vote in which turnout was well above 70% of the entire voting population. The Welsh voted largely to Leave. You had a significant number of Leave voters even in places in Scotland and North Ireland, even in London, which right now has begun to resemble Mogadishu. You still have, what, 25 to a third of the population. That's significant. It wasn't just rural countryside England voting to leave, and even if it had been, why should they not be listened to? They feel like they haven't been listened to by their government. You had a substantial proportion of Labour voters voting apparently to leave. That's because they feel the Labour Party has largely stopped listening to Labour, that is the working class, the people doing the mining, doing the farming and so forth. They want to be protected. Their political interests and their economic interests, they want protected by their government. Their government just calls them racists if they don't want people to come in and take their jobs. Now, you can call that xenophobic all you want, but when you're talking about one small, densely populated island, it does make sense to conjecture that that is a possibility, that some of these people are getting economically and socially fucked because of this. So, and the other thing people are talking about, oh, there's so many theories on this. Oh, what state might leave next? You're going to see a short period here where nobody, you'll see like, Front National and these groups talking about the possibility of their own nations leaving. You will see that. For the short term, you're probably not going to see much movement in that because these groups are going to want to see what happens in the UK. And like I pointed out, no matter what the EU does regarding the UK, whether it punishes them or not, they're not long for this world. And you can tell the number of threats that they issued before the referendum was frenetic and unreasonable. They acted as though literal Armageddon, World War III, and nuclear doomsday would erupt immediately after a leave vote. Clearly, that's not the case. Why were they issuing such threats? Because they realized, the EU's heads, if the UK left, the EU is doomed. There'd be a chance they can hold it together at least for a while if the UK stayed. The fact that they have left has them terrified. They'll fuck around as much as they can with world markets, get celebrities to come out and cry J.K. Rowling, oh, I wish I could wave a magic Harry Potter wand to make it a Remain vote. What's the fucking point? Michael Moore's having a nervous breakdown, Salon being liberal. They're trying to draw these weird comparisons with the U.S. elections. Need I remind you, it wasn't that great a majority of conservatives that voted to leave, but it was a fairly sizable minority of Labour, which is further left than Bernie Sanders, that also voted to leave. It wasn't just UKIP doing this. It wasn't just Tories doing this. A lot of far left individuals, even like fucking communists, were voting to leave because they don't like the EU either. Again, take a look at Greece. The range of parties that are Eurosceptic in Greece, whether they're hard or soft Eurosceptics, ranges from literal communist parties all the way to literal racial nationalist parties. It's no longer, oh, these far-righters want out of the EU because, I don't know, I don't even know why they'd want out of the EU. The EU's an interventionist system. It seems to fit in with what we would consider like neocons or Hillary liberals. It's sort of the Bernie Sanders far-left edge and the Trump populists, and then some mix of other random individuals that are supporting the concept of dissolving the EU. And this is not just in the UK, this is in many other states there as well. A subset of the population, even in the most Euro-friendly nations, is still Eurosceptic. It may not be large in many of these states, but it's going to grow now. Now, which other states would leave? In my opinion, Greece is an obvious choice. They've been screwed. Their economy is still basically screwed. Poverty has risen substantially there. There are tales that you've got prostitutes selling their body for a sandwich in Greece. I would think that at that point there would be some serious talk between these parties about holding their own referendum. Now, the Germans may not care if Greece leaves, because then they're like, oh, well, we don't have to bail them out or anything. They still have a bunch of debt. The Greeks may just decide, fuck you. What are you going to do about it? Invade us? Good luck. The German military is none too great now anymore either, so it'd be funny to see them actually try to do so. That's not going to happen. The Greeks are probably going to be the next to hold a referendum, and they'll probably leave if they do. I would bet that Sweden will hold one. I think they'll remain. I think, unfortunately, some of the Eurosceptic parties will look at this, be so emboldened, they try to hold a referendum as quickly as possible without realizing they haven't gained enough traction yet. They need to let this simmer for a little while, at least some months, if not a year or two, in order to get their nations out of the EU. This will not be a slow process whereby a month from now half of the EU has left. It's just not going to happen. Maybe in a perfect world, the EU would dissolve, today. It would be dissolved already. The UK would leave and all these other people would say, bye, this is done. Obviously, the second largest economy in the EU is gone. Fuck this. We're going with the UK and we're going to have our own trade deals. I think that other than Greece, though, none of the other states there are Eurosceptic enough to leave right away. But if only Greece were to hold a referendum soon and then leave, there's 2 countries out of the EU in a fairly short span of time. And probably the far left and the far right in Greece really need to talk to each other, get something like this going, and I have a feeling it will. Italy, apparently, they're gathering signatures already. It's going to happen in France. It'll probably happen in Sweden. You're going to see the resurgence. If you think that populism and nationalism has risen up in Europe already, if you think that it's prevalent now, just wait until a half a dozen states hold referendums and they do better than the last independence referendum did in the UK. And they get emboldened by that and say, oh, just a little bit further, we can hold this shit again. That's number one. And just wait until those populists, nationalists, and even, the communists, again, far left, communists, socialists, and so forth, when they get denied the ability to leave the EU, as the EU enforces both far-right so-called austerity measures on some states, especially the left-leaning states that have fucked their economies, and tries to socialize the further right economies like it tried to do to the UK, it's alienating everyone, and that's really the problem. The Germans are trying to balance things out by giving austerity to states that have, like, the fucking communist and socialist parties in charge, and they're trying to cause states that are more conservative to spend more in order to, I guess, to balance things out economically. The problem is you've alienated everyone in doing so. It's not going to work. The European Union will dissolve. There will be very little of it, if anything, left. The possible forms it could take. You could end up with a soft Eurosceptic movement taking hold, in which Germany maintains its vassals, but the immigration issue is taken, sort of put on the back burner, where the free movement to some degree has dried up, other than those that are literally EU citizens. You could see something like that. I think that would play up in states where it's really about the immigration issue, like Sweden. They don't really have the economic pinch as much. That's probably what they would go for. Or you may see a hard breakup, in which case one of two things happens. The EU is just demolished entirely because it's no longer economically tenable, or it becomes Germany and Germany's buddies. In which case, the EU could survive in that form because it would just be pan-Germania, basically. It'd be like a Fourth Reich. It would literally be like Germany and Austria, maybe Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Netherlands and Denmark, maybe. It would begin to look a little bit like, Hitlerland or something like that. It'd be amusing, but that could work. But all of these other countries, especially the southern European states and the Nordic states, why would they want to stay in this failed experiment? The Swedes, certain Swedish groups, already said, yeah, if the UK's out, we're going to try to get out too and form a bloc with them. The Norwegians probably wouldn't be, it wouldn't be difficult to convince them that that was a good idea either. These northern European states that are all very wealthy and have the resources, they could easily do that. It'd be a very strong union. Then you'd have a South European Union, and then you'd have, again, Germany, its vassal states. And anyone that's left behind, they fit in wherever they choose to fit in, or they're not a member of any of these unions and just sort of go it alone. The idea, I think, that any of these states, from the smallest and weakest to the largest and strongest, needs to be in the EU to survive, has just been shattered. That illusion is no longer in play, and I think that's one of the things mainly holding back people from dissolving the EU. I think there's some confusion, I believe, between the EU and NATO. I think a lot of younger people don't realize NATO even exists. They think the EU is a military bloc. They don't even realize that there's such a thing as NATO that actually defends the borders of Europe. I mean, several times now I've talked to people that appear to believe the EU is a military alliance. primarily. That's what allows these states to defend one another. That's not the case. All of Europe is guaranteed sovereignty by the US. You know, the Russians are not going to, when people talk about, oh, Putin might invade the Baltic states, Putin might attack Poland, Putin might attack Turkey, Putin might try to go for Finland again, as though it worked so well the fucking last time when the Soviets lost, what, 100,000 troops or something in the endeavor. It's not going to happen. The United States will guarantee the sovereignty of Europe. And, you know, it's the EU breaking up is not going to endanger that. You might have a couple European states that lean more east aligned and so they do trade with Russia and get weapons. Who cares? It's a small price to pay for the amount of economic growth you'd get and the fact that these countries can determine their own destiny. This was a democratic vote. If you don't like the fact that the UK has left the EU and you're in the UK, leave the UK. You can go be with the Europeans. Go be a European in a European Union state if you feel disenfranchised by this. You may find that it's all cracked up to be, especially now that the UK has left. That's about all. Peace out.